Mrs. Eleanor Maple sat quietly in her usual seat on the 4:50 train from Paddington station. The winter evening was already dark, and the lights from passing trains briefly illuminated her compartment. She had made this journey every Tuesday for the past 15 years to visit her sister in Oxford, and she knew every stop along the way. As another train passed by on the parallel track, something caught her eye. In the brightly lit window of the other train, she saw a man with his hands around a woman's throat. The scene lasted only seconds before both trains moved apart, but Mrs. Maple was certain of what she had witnessed. Her hands trembling, she reported the incident to the conductor, who seemed skeptical but dutifully made a note. When she arrived in Oxford, she went straight to the police station. Inspector James Harrison listened patiently to her story. "The problem, Mrs. Maple," he said, "is that no body has been reported, and we don't know which train you saw or who the passengers might have been." But Mrs. Maple was not one to be dismissed easily. "Inspector, I've been taking this route for 15 years. The train I saw was the 4:45 express to Bristol. It always passes our train at exactly 5:03 p.m. near the Thornfield Junction." Inspector Harrison's interest grew. He began checking the passenger lists and train schedules. Sure enough, the 4:45 to Bristol had been running on time that evening. More importantly, a first-class ticket had been purchased by a Mrs. Victoria Winters, who never arrived at her destination. The investigation revealed that Mrs. Winters had recently changed her will, leaving her considerable fortune to her nephew, Charles Winters. Charles claimed he had been at his club in London at the time of the incident, but the club's register showed no record of his presence that day. A search of the railway line near Thornfield Junction yielded Mrs. Winters' handbag, partially hidden in some bushes. Inside was a threatening note: "You'll regret changing the will." The case seemed to be building against Charles Winters, but Inspector Harrison wasn't entirely convinced. Something about the timing bothered him. He asked Mrs. Maple to review her story one more time. "Think carefully, Mrs. Maple. You said you always see the Bristol train at 5:03 p.m., but the sun sets at 4:30 p.m. this time of year. How could you have seen so clearly into the other train in complete darkness?" Mrs. Maple's eyes widened. "Why, you're right, Inspector. I could see everything clearly because the compartment was so brightly lit. Much brighter than usual." This detail led the police to interview the train's cleaning staff. One cleaner remembered something odd. The first-class compartment lights had been tampered with, replaced with much stronger bulbs. The real killer turned out to be Mrs. Winters' personal secretary, James Morton. He had carefully planned the murder, deliberately increasing the lighting to ensure witnesses would see Charles Winters, whom he had paid to take the train while wearing a disguise. Morton had been embezzling from Mrs. Winters for years, and she had recently discovered his theft. When confronted with the evidence, Morton confessed. Charles Winters also admitted his role in the plot, in exchange for a lighter sentence. In the end, it was Mrs. Maple's sharp eye for detail and Inspector Harrison's careful analysis that brought the true killer to justice. As Mrs. Maple returned to her usual Tuesday journey, she could never pass Thornfield Junction without remembering the night she witnessed a murder plot unfold through a train window. Sometimes, Inspector Harrison later remarked, the most important clue isn't what you see, but how you're able to see it at all.